Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. I know we have people joining from all over the world, from Asia, from North America, from Europe, from Africa, and South America. So we have people from almost all over, and I think there are few from Australia as well. And so it's a pretty good representation from participant side. It's going to grow. I'm Sumant Timsina. I'm with the International Development Institute, and I'm going to introduce shortly our moderator for today and talk to you a little bit about our other events, other programs, and we go from there. And this, I'm just going to bring the PowerPoint up and we will start. Thank you so much. Okay, once again, I'm Sumant Timsina. I'm with International Development Institute. We are located in Washington, D.C. area as its headquarters. And we are also branched out to Nepal, Bangladesh, UK, and Nigeria, in 4 countries at this point. And we do have representation in a few other countries. And we are primarily a training and development institute with capacity building, and we do program in lots of different areas from the government as well as for private sectors. And it varies from tourism to capacity building in the local government to federal government, as well as a legislative system in Supreme Court. We do lots of training for the Supreme Court, and school programs in education, school and teachers and principals. So we have been doing lots of training programs for the last 13 years now. And recently, we all are impacted all over the world with COVID-19. There's no travel, no personal contact. So we have been doing webinar, and this will be our 5th webinar. And now we have been scheduled almost 2 webinars a week. So I will encourage you to check out our website time to time and see what else is scheduled. And you can sign up. It's the same process to sign up. And we had a big program schedule actually for June on public-private partnership, and that led to this. That was a procurement training, and that led to this PPP workshop. And I'm going to introduce our moderator briefly, and he will take it from there. So before we start, we had a very sad news yesterday. It's not COVID related, but Dr. Vishnu Porel, who had been in Washington, D.C. area for about 50 years, he passed away yesterday peacefully in his house. He was 89 years old, and he was one of our partners and a very well-known personality in this area. He was a lifelong Rotarian. He was a president of a school, of a university, and dean. He served in lots of different capacity. So we just wanted to mention here in this audience as well and pay tribute to him. And moving forward, our upcoming trainings, they are right now scheduled, are in 2 areas. One is in education. We did an education training last week on webinar on how it's impacting the school system or all the education system from K to 12 as well as the higher education with this all this COVID-19. In US, most of the states, schools are shut, schools are closed for the rest of the academic year. Universities are teaching remotely, schools are teaching remotely, kids are logged in as house. But what are the challenges with that? And the second phase of that is coming up on next Monday on remote instructional strategies and engaging in learning effectively. So that's going to come up next very soon. And following week, next week on from Wednesday, and the following week on Monday and Wednesday, we have 3 topics for financial institutions. As I mentioned, we have done many trainings for the banking sector as well as cooperatives. So they have shown interest on what are the challenges with the supervisory responsibilities with closing all the banks or not having a personal contact with customers. That raises lots of challenges in cybersecurity risk as well as anti-money laundering. And so we have been, we're going to do those 2 trainings. And having said that, let me introduce our uh, our moderator for today. And this is a training on PPP, but we're going to focus on tourism. Reason we're going to focus on tourism, John is going to talk a little more about it. We have been very committed to work on tourism. We've been doing this tourism work for the last couple of years. And with the tourism work done for the last couple of years, we have John and I co-chaired about 2 years ago, John, about 2 years ago, accessible tourism conference on accessible tourism that was held in Kathmandu, in Pokhara in Nepal. And there were about 180 attendees, and we partnered very well with the Nepal Tourism Board, government of Nepal, and John will highlight some more of those partnerships. And John has been working in tourism for all his life, for 30 plus years, and sorry to disclose your age, John, here. And John is very well traveled. He has worked with USAID and many other institutions and many other consulting companies. And right now he's teaching tourism for Arizona State University, and he was teaching in their campus in China. And with COVID-19, he came here in December on Christmas, and he hasn't gone back. And he has created a very nice backdrop for himself, thinking of China. And he is here in Washington, the suburbs of Washington, D.C. And he's teaching remotely right now. So John, it's all yours.
Thank you very
John,
much.
just 1 second. John, just 1 second. So during this, if you have any questions or anything, I would like you to send your question through chat window or through Q&A. And towards the end of David's presentation, John will pick up from there, and we will try to answer as many Q&A as we can. All right, John, all yours.
Thank you so much, Suman. And again, welcome to everybody to this very timely and focused discussion on public-private partnerships. I want to welcome everybody from around the world and joining us. Thank you for taking your time. Let's recognize IDI for their organizational capability in teaching remotely and being able to put people together in this very important time for the tourism industry. Very, very lucky to have David Baxter today, an expert in public-private partnerships, to be able to really give us some good background and some application and case study on really how to put the public and private sector together. Now, as you know, tourism is a hugely complex industry, service industry, and nobody is able to do their business all by themselves. There's an incredible amount of collaboration at every single stage of tourism when things are running well. Now, with this disruption, there's no more important time for the tourism industry and government and community, all the stakeholders, to be working together. This is not a time where we should be sitting idle. We should actually really be focused now and working harder than ever, planning on reopening. As Suman said, I'm a lecturer for Arizona State University, but I'm lecturing in Hainan, China at Hainan University. So at this point, I just want to say hi to all my students and faculty at the Hainan University, Arizona State University International Tourism College in Haikou, Hainan, China. So hello to them. And just sort of relate to everybody on the outset of, again, there was a major crisis in China. They've directed all of their attention at resolving it. And daily I speak with students about how their freedom has returned and how their tourism is returning. So just looking at that application in that progression, it gives me a bit of hope on a quick and hopefully a speedier tourism recovery, focusing first on their domestic market and eventually opening up. So there is sort of a bright spot there. Let me quickly go through an overview here. So basically, thank you again, IDI. And today we'll be talking with, we'll be having a presentation from David Baxter. One of the things at the very outset, just let me take a minute or two on the importance of public-private partnerships in tourism, is we're celebrating our 2-year anniversary of a PPP in Nepal, looked at IDI and myself and a few other people here in DC worked with the Nepal Tourism Board, the government sector for directing tourism and tourism companies in Nepal to do a conference called the International Conference on Accessible Adventure. Okay, that was sort of our idea. We put together, and as Suman said, I think we had about 180 participants. But the focus here is, in the example here, is that we were able to get together and put together a 4-day conference. And then we were also able to improve tourism and the product. So the real great outcome of it was not only learning and being able to share the best cases and best practices in tourism, but we applied them as well. And the government stepped up and was able to actually create a tourism product out of all of our recommendations. And we created the first accessible trekking trail in Nepal. And so I think that provides a great background on the importance of working together with the government, with the private sector. And the recovery applications are threefold. Number one is a blue ocean strategy that we should be looking at, opening up new markets. This one was looking at the retiree markets and the mobile disabled. Product development, we opened up a new attraction there for a specific market. And then lastly, the application of this PPP was branding, opening up Nepal to not just adventure tourism, but also for the retiree market and also the mobile disabled, and more focus on culture. So I think that was a good example in our 2-year anniversary of a great PPP. And so I wanted to use that to segue into our presentation today by David Baxter. So just a bit of background on David. He's an independent PPP consultant, started his career environmentally focused on development in partnership with the South African Department of Tourism. He worked with federal agencies throughout the USA, has been focused on recreation and tourism concessionary activities. Particularly if you look at national parks, state parks, all sorts of integration between the private sector, taking many services in the national parks, very, very important business opportunities, and great to partnership to give expertise to the National Park Service there. Currently, David has been advising institutions, private sector all over the world. He's been with the National Park Service, the Forest Service, Fish and Wildlife Service, and he's also been working with the World Bank, the Millennium Challenge Corporation, and USAID. Right now, he's a senior advisor to the International Sustainability Resilience Center in New Orleans, which is affiliated with a lot of different centers of excellence. Okay, basically today David's going to give a presentation. He'll begin with a U.S. overview, and then talk about defining PPPs and looking at the guiding principles of PPPs. We'll look at COVID recovery type of recommendations and opportunities. And then lastly, he'll talk about some different case studies in PPPs. Again, as Suman has advised, if you have questions, please put them in the Q&A. And the last part of our presentation today will be question and answer with David. And then we'll wrap up on what we've learned today. So without any further ado, let me introduce David Baxter. It's great to have you here. Thank you for your time. And I truly look forward to your insight today.
Good morning, good afternoon, good evening to everyone. And I am going to click the right button, I hope, and I'm going to start my presentation. Let me just see here. Okay, and okay. Well, I'm going to talk, as was mentioned, about tourism and the important role it plays. Tourism itself is increasingly being seen as a mechanism to improve the economies of countries. Many people, even in the United States, don't realize how extensive the National Park Service system is. And I've just put up this map here. Unfortunately, it's not very clear, but you can see the link where you can find it. But wherever there's a dot, that is a national park, a wildlife service, refuge. and they are scattered all over the country and play an integrated role in specifically and especially in rural communities where they're located. They are accessible to millions and millions and millions of Americans. And if you go out into the West, if you go into the Rocky Mountains and the Western states, you cannot almost separate the tourism economy from the economy of most counties and the states in that region. And if you just look at some of the numbers, there's 69 national parks, 130 national monuments, 154 national forests, 20 national grasslands, and the National Wildlife Service also has 36,000, just for example, just 36,000 fell protection areas where people go and recreate and can even go hunting with permits. These activities generate millions, if not billions of dollars for the federal government, for local communities, and for the states as well. If you look at that map, if you remember that map that I previously shown, I just wanted to show you that from the Johns Hopkins site, if you've been following it, this is the spread of COVID-19 in the United States. And this is about 2 days old. I'm sure it's even redder than it is now. And you can just see from the map and the distribution of how many of these areas have been impacted. But it's not just recreation in national parks, it's also many, many other activities. And I've listed there, you can imagine Los Angeles with Disneyland, Universal Studios, Hollywood. People can't go there anymore. Millions and millions of lost revenue. Las Vegas, can you imagine going to Las Vegas now and walking down the strip and there's absolutely no one there? The tourism has died there, never mind the supportive tourism. For example, helicopter services when people fly over the Grand Canyon. San Francisco, the winelands. Seattle, the cruise industry, screeching halt. And that was one of the biggest industries in the tourism industry that was impacted. Denver, mountain skiing. You go to Miami, Orlando, the cruise industry. Disney World, Universal Studios, Atlanta, the Delta hub, the biggest airline hub in the world. I think they have maybe 50, 60 flights a day now. Just Washington, D.C. with the National Capital Tourism, and New York. These are just examples in the United States, but they're being repeated worldwide, and they're facing or putting everyone under a tremendous amount of stress, especially people who rely on these activities. And it's not just the formal sector, it can be in many countries, informal sector members, traders, artisans, handicraft folks. This is all gone and they are struggling. So when we talk about a public-private partnership, I just want to highlight certain things. You know, sometimes when people talk about public-private partnerships, they talk about partnerships between the public and private sector, which in my instance, as far as my experience is that they are more along the lines of a philanthropy, where there's a long-term agreement between a private sector institution that has money, a sense of corporate social responsibility, and it reaches out to the community and helps people do certain things, train, gives them markets, etc. But it's not long lasting because it lasts as long as there is a sense of corporate social responsibility or there's money available. What I want to just focus a little bit more on formal public-private partnerships. These are ones that can last 20, 30, 40 years. Here in Virginia, there was even a public-private partnership that was signed for 99 years. But public-private partnerships, according to the World Bank, can be seen as a tool to get quality infrastructure services to more people, and infrastructure is critically important for tourism. They also need to operate in a balanced regulatory environment. And so what I mean by that is that there needs to be an enabling environment for cooperation between the public and private sector. Investors are not sentimental. And so if they don't have an environment that works well for them, they will go elsewhere. They can also bring great efficiency and sustainability to the provision of services. In many cases, and this is a reality, the government is not always the best position to provide the services, but the private sector is. And so in partnerships, especially in the tourism area, where the private sector, for example, takes over tourism lodges and services and national parks, for example, you'll find a better efficiency, much more efficiency and sustainability in private, in the services. One of the challenges always is the allocation of risk, who bears the risk, and this needs to be a very balanced approach. But as you can see, the World Bank has also stated that PPPs are long-term contract between the public and private sector in this sense, and where the private party takes on risk and management responsibility because they're going to run it, and then they are remunerated, rewarded, paid, however you want to call it, due to their performance. One of the reasons also that's incredibly important for public-private partnerships is the innovation that the private sector can bring. And often they are much more efficient than governments, and so they can improve delivery of products, services, goods on time, and more likely to be on budget, because they're much more focused on surviving and making a certain amount of profit. I seem to have got stuck here. Okay, so the World Bank put out a very, very good source, and I don't know if you've seen this, this is worthwhile loading it down. They put out a handshake series on different types of PPPs, but what they also did was they published the handshake on tourism PPPs, and this was published by the IFC, but it was a partnership with the World Bank family. And the statement was made that public-private partnerships unite two sides for the greater good, and the private sector's role complements the public sector's role for development, growth, and effectiveness in tourism. And then it's important to note is that tourism is, John alluded to this, that tourism and travel by nature is a partnership between the public and private sector. And also it's important that projects between the tourism and travel sector, you can call them, or just the tourism sector in general, need to be based on sound commercial principles as well. Most people, for example, when they travel and they go to national parks in the United States, have no idea that private and for-profit and even non-profit organizations run thousands of concessions in national parks. Every time you go to a national park in the United States and you use a people mover or a bus system, it's a concession. Every time you stay in a lodge, it is a concession. Every time you buy something at a tourist shop, it is a concession. And for example, in 2014, there were 3 million visitors. It's up now. But it's also important noting that, as it states here in this article where Warren Majeure wrote, he said that it's worth noting that national parks and concessions play a vital role in helping the National Park Service carry out its mission, and that there are benefits to these partnerships that keep the parks viable and visitors happy. You know, I often look at reviews that are put out on social media about visitations to tourism sectors and that, and the biggest killer is if visitors are not happy. And this is where the private sector can introduce vigor, new ideas, innovation, resources, and help improve the situation in parks. So the question is, can PPP strengthen tourism in the post-COVID-19 era? I absolutely believe, yes, there's going to be a greater funding gap. I've just been reading constantly about cities, states, institutions that are not going to have funding available or cutting back on funding because of loss of taxation revenue. So the private sector is going to play an important role. And there are investors who are sitting on billions, if not trillions of dollars that they've withdrawn from risky, as they perceive it, shares or companies who are looking for a place to put money into. And I believe that this can happen. One of the things that we really do need to look at is the holistic cycle of PPPs. So we need to look at the design, the build, the finance, the operating, and the maintenance of PPPs, whether they general PPPs or tourism as well. And it is important that countries, the public sector, in partnership with the private sector, start looking for recovery best practices. One of the elements that's being pushed heavily by the United Nations Economic Commission for Europe is the whole idea of people first PPPs. And, you know, we should be more focused on efficiency and delighting tourists, as I've said. There is a value in working with tourism as well when it is seasonal, having partnerships with the private sector, because they can bring in a workforce that tends to be less expensive when the season is down because you don't have to employ them. And it's not exploitative. Many of these workers are seasonal workers in their sense. But tourism PPPs, I would say, require stringent government oversight, but not over management. You need to give the private sector a chance to introduce its innovation. I believe the time is right to explore innovative ways to implement PPPs through a synthesis of sustainable, resilient best practices, which is importantly that progressively improve delivery over time and outperform their proponents' original expectations. Only this will lead to the recovery of tourism. So when you have these partnerships, there are always end goals that the partnership infrastructure or the service or the facility must be maintained and handed back at most times to the government in a good working state. I say this is a time to take it even further and make it better than when they started. We need to look at projects that keep on delivering. We also need to have flexible PPP agreements. Too many contracts are inflexible. They've had a problem with force majeure, for example. They don't address plagues, for example, if you want to call COVID-19 a plague, pandemics. And so we see now that in many instances, for example, even in the restaurant industry in the United States at the moment, that insurance companies are not going to back up interrupted service insurance. This is not the tourism, restaurants, hospitality sector's fault, but this is going to cause many of them to go bankrupt. So we need to decide, do we want tourism and its supporting infrastructure to survive, or do we want to drive it in the ground? Because punitive actions based on force majeure clauses that do not bolster the survivability of PPPs are going to be counterproductive. And the fact is that investors, tourism operators are going to look at countries, how they respond, and those that respond well will become attractive investment destinations. Those that don't are not going to have an easy time restarting. And I think we need to have best practice mechanisms that constantly recalibrate projects so you can recalibrate and determine how to proceed. So this is where I come up with the idea that you need to have proactive adaptation. You need to also have transparent and competitive procurement procedures. If there's any sense that there's favoritism that is happening, you are going to find that people are just not going to invest in that sector. It's also important that we look at regenerative sustainability of projects. What can we do to build sustainability into projects that constantly regenerates them, rebuilds them, and keeps them running? We also need to look at how we allocate risks. Putting all the risks on one party is never a good idea. I talked about addressing force majeure clauses in a flexible manner, but we also need to ensure that the private sector is seen as an equal and trusted partner. And we also need to ensure that unnecessary bureaucratic red tape is eliminated. It's great to have red tape. You can have guidelines and practices in place. These are good because they prevent fraud and bad decisions being made. But if they hold up the recovery at the moment, they need to be revisited. And also you need to revisit your partners to ensure that they are responsible parties that are committed to the recovery and that are signaling intent to remain committed to pragmatic and practical policy approaches. There's a question, everyone's in crisis mode at the moment. I think we need to start looking now, while we have the time, at long-term recovery actions, especially when it comes to PPPs. PPPs are going to be 20, 30, 40, 50 years. Many of them are operating at the moment. What can we do to ensure that these contracts, which were set up 5 years ago, 10 years ago, what can we do to them to ensure that these long-term projects survive? We also need to look at PPP tourism projects that are lined up, because there's a situation where, that the situation's changed. We need to be smart. And I talked about what we mean by smart. We need to be sustainable. We need to be maintenance focused. This is a fantastic time for tourism infrastructure to be maintained. Projects at airports like runways can move ahead rapidly while airports are shut down. Improvements to facilities can happen. I just read this morning an article in the Washington Post about national parks that are using this time as a great opportunity to refurbish and renew and fix facilities that have got a little shabby or run behind because of constant use. We need to look at resilience. We also need to focus on technology that is adaptive. Technology can become obsolescent very quickly unless we look at finding ways to introduce flexibility and application of technology. We are always going to be behind the curve, and not the coronavirus curve, just the operation curve. I think it's important that we look at the 4 R's of resilience. This is robustness, redundancy, resourcefulness, and rapidity. And but what we mean by rapidity is the ability to regenerate and to restart. Just some cases quickly of PPPs. The Gorongosa National Park, I come from South Africa originally, and this is one of the greatest parks in the world and was one of the best examples of a public-private partnership. The park was decimated during the Mozambican Civil War. There was nothing at the end of it. And an agreement was reached to create this, national park. There was the Carr Foundation. It's an amazing story. You should read up the Carr Foundation if you want to hear about ways that you can regenerate tourism, which was a non-profit organization, signed a 20-year contract, and here's important, for the joint management of the park. And what they have done is they've adopted a 21st century conservation model of balancing the needs of the wildlife and people, and they are protecting them and saving this wilderness. I just included at the top there an announcement. So COVID-19 has reached even this very remote area in Mozambique, where they say we have decided to close down tourism. Until further notice, we want to play a part in reducing movement and transmission of this disease that has potential to profoundly affect the community surrounding the park. To me, this is admirable because they are showing a concern for their other stakeholders that are around them. They also, are focused on conservation, obviously. Importantly, they are focused on community, and this is an important factor for tourism. It's not just the tourists who visit and go away, but it's the surrounding communities. Applying science and then the ideas of sustainable tourism. And if you go to their website, you can read up about that. I just want to give 2 case studies very quickly. One is Nishan A, who's actually a very good friend of mine, and I got to know him when I was doing work in Sri Lanka last year for USAID. He formed a company called Sunny Salon Travels, and he has experienced 3 disasters in his company's tourism history. One was the tsunami that occurred, the Indian Ocean tsunami event that occurred 10 years ago. Last year, I was in Sri Lanka. What happened, I don't know if you remember, there was a situation when there was the massive terrorism attacks over Easter, where hundreds of people were killed, and the tourism economy collapsed. And just as they started recovering, he actually now faces a total collapse again. You can just see all the type of activities he offers, and every one of those activities is a different partner and a different type of industry that is associated with it. And this is just an indication of the terrible things that happen. He's recovered twice, and we can only hope that he will recover a 3rd time as well. Then there's the story of agro tourism, which is becoming importantly focused. You can just think of the wine industry in California as more well known, but South Africa has a very well known and well developed wine industry. And here is the situation of a wine farm called Boshendal. Maybe some of you have been there. Janet B is my sister, Janet Baxter, and she works at this farm as a community outreach person and an education specialist. And what she has done is, in the time that everything collapsed, they have used their facilities on the farm to help the communities around them weather this storm. Again, an example of the greater impact that tourism can have on the surrounding communities. Here's a picture you can see of bread. They've opened a community kitchen where they bake bread for the surrounding community. So all their fancy restaurant facilities are now being used to provide or to bake bread. And there's another picture you can see there where they packed or prepared 450 sanitary packs for the community. Everything from the bottles there, those blue bottles of bleach, gloves, masks, everything that they could do to help it. So just again, an idea of why tourism is so incredibly important for the surrounding communities. Can it survive? Yes. Will it survive? Yes. Will they recover? Yes. But it all depends on the efforts that are put into this by the communities that are there. So when we talk about public-private partnerships, we're talking about strong partnerships between the public and the private sector, but this also needs to include the stakeholders, which are the communities and people around them that work there, use them, and enjoy them. So just finally, in my last comments, if you are interested, if you go to my LinkedIn site, I've written a number of articles or blogs, whatever you want to call them, on resiliency, recovery. Some of these were more focused on Katrina, but there are insights in there which I think would be useful and valuable to those who are looking for approaches to how to recover. So thank you very much, and I am going to hand over. And I hope that this was an opportunity for at least you to gain in a very short time some insights.
Fantastic, David, and great insight, not only particularly looking at specifically in America, where you've been working with the National Park Service, the importance of that integral partnership between the private sector and the government sector, but also giving us case study and kind of great foundational guiding principles for public-private partnerships. Let me just start off with a couple of questions, and then we will go to the questions from our audience here. Number one is that foundationally that public-private partnerships, collaboration between the public sector and the private sector and community, you said are kind of the foundation for all of tourism development and investor confidence. So I think that's a really good focal point to start off. Could you just elaborate on that anymore? I mean, it was a great insight in that if the community and the government aren't working together, you're not going to get people to invest. So maybe you can just elaborate on that as providing the foundation for PPPs.
So I can just think of, for example, in Eastern Europe, before the communist bloc collapsed, there were notorious stories of what it was like to go to a state-owned or state-run hotel, terrible services, bad food, etc. And yet you find now in Eastern Europe, many of these hotels that were former government-owned or operated institutions, they still might be government-owned, have been now handed over to private operators, and there's a dramatic improvement in the services. But these have all been done through formal concessionary agreements or, for example, PPP agreements. It's not only the infrastructure of the hotels and restaurants and buildings as well, but it's also formal PPPs for airports, for example. So you can imagine, for example, Dubai. What would Dubai be like if there wasn't a fantastic airport that's run through the Dubai Airport Authority, which in a way is a concessionary PPP. So there are many, many examples along those lines. I think in the sense of the bigger the infrastructure or the bigger the project, it's more and more important for these arrangements to be more formal. But when it boils down to grassroots level, I think the type of PPPs are more just the general partnerships, which are based on NGOs supporting tourism, artisans, etc. So we can't forget the range of PPPs.
Fantastic. And again, it's such a collaborative network that our industry is involved in. And that's why it's so important right now is not turning internally, but looking externally and really working with your government as closely as possible. Hugely important because the people and businesses on the ground actually have the feel for tourism and what is needed. But they need to be speaking with a collective voice to the government on what the priorities are. And that kind of leads me to my second question, David, is that you brought up, we're going to have a big gap in governmental funding for critical tourism infrastructure. So do you think it's a very important time now for the tourism industry to be talking collectively and being able to prioritize which projects should be the initial focus with that limited type of funding that we're going to see for the next year or two?
That's a good question. I think it's important specifically for existing formalized concessions. Most of them are based on availability payments. And, this basically, for airports, for example, or for use of cruise terminals at ports, for example. And if they can't be used, then there's always the question of who's going to pay for their use. This isn't a time to, enforce punitive contract arrangements, and say to the operator, well, you better find the money. It might be a chance where the government and the operator could sit down and have a discussion and say, can we extend it? Can you give us some bridge funding? Or can we find investors, to invest in the funding of the operations of the projects until tourism picks up? The question is, where do you start? Do you start with a large infrastructure? Do you start at state level? Do you start at local level? I think it's going to be important, especially in the United States, where it seems that they have regional blocks of states that have decided that they will design their recovery strategy. And what I think is important, as certain sectors of the economy open up, the tourism industry needs to calibrate their opening up with those actions as well. So there's talk of, opening up maybe restaurants, small businesses. That's a good entry point. Later on, I think big theaters and cinemas are going to open up because there's a focus, you can't have large crowds in a confined space. Critically, I think also that as a lot of the infrastructure stands dormant, the tourism infrastructure stands dormant, this is a golden opportunity for operations, for maintenance to take place, as I said earlier. And if that's the case, this will allow people to be employed. It's not just the people who, are doing the fun rides, but there's the electricians, the carpenters, the ground crews that maintain these facilities. So I think a phased step is going to take place. And I think opportunities are going to have to be found where the government finds investors who can bridge that gap and provide, some of the financing that is needed. It's going to be difficult. But what is really important, I think, is that these efforts need to be coordinated and not be just randomly and haphazardly implemented.
Excellent, because you've identified two focal points. Number one is on the funding side, in being able to work with private sector to be able to work on funding projects. And then the other side you worked on is the labor. And there's been a couple of comments and questions regarding the public works programs of the Great Depression in the U.S. Being focused on improving, as you've mentioned, attractions, upgrading attractions, upgrading infrastructure, roadways, airports, terminals, ports. So very, very important on those two. We have a question regarding force majeure. And can you maybe explain the terminology a little bit better? And then basically there's been some questions on, let's see, what particular clause of a concession agreement can be incorporated to safeguard both parties in a situation like this, other than force majeure. So maybe you can talk a little bit about force majeure, how you would recommend best approaching it in the COVID health crisis recovery.
Great. So, force majeure generally refers to, in the old times, it was an act of God or an act of nature, something that was unforeseen that could impact the operation of a project. Recently, I took a look at the World Bank's guidance for PPPs and force majeure. And unfortunately, there, as well as with many institutions, it's kind of vague and very unclear. And the reason for that is because no one really ever thought these big events were going to happen when the contracts were set up, or people took chances. And it's all about, risk allocation and who's responsible for the risk. Typically, governments are responsible in a very large formal PPP project. They're responsible for force majeure events. And this is not construction risk where construction is delayed or fails. This is, something that we couldn't expect. And what astounded me is when I looked at the language, the types of ways they try to discuss force majeure, and I think the thing that surprised me the most was just for hurricanes. They can be called hurricanes in some countries, they're called tropical storms in other places, they're called cyclones in others. And, you know, I could just see some smart lawyers saying, well, the language said hurricane, but we don't have hurricanes in our part of the world. We have, you know, tropical storms, so it doesn't count. We need to move away from that mentality. The other is, you know, the question under force majeure, are we going to be punitive and destroy the project? Because if a PPP project fails, and it should never be the option if there's a way to fix a challenge, for example, a force majeure one, if it fails, it is really important to understand that to regenerate, kickstart, however you want to call it, an existing PPP project could take 2 to 3 years if you're going to do another procurement, you know, etc. So do you want that? If the answer is no, think innovatively, think proactively, and find ways that you can look at contracts, look at the clauses, and say, you know, what can we do to rewrite this? What can we do to extend this? What can we do to improve this? Even if it means that the PPP contract is extended by another 2 or 3 years at the end to make up lost time, lost revenue, and et cetera, just to ensure that that PPP project survives.
Good. I think that's some good insight into kind of the more intricate details. And I think we could also do, that would make a fantastic webinar in and of itself, I think. And we could probably talk for a good hour on how to approach the force majeure issue in existing and future contracts. Kind of shifting a little bit here. Let's look at kind of innovation. And again, a crisis can be a mode of switching gears, of disruption and creating new innovation. A question here is how can PPP leadership encourage startups, young innovators, and creative minds to bring out the opportunities in the crisis to rebuild tourism?
That's a good point. A few years ago, I went to the Canary Islands, which is a territory of Spain. And I was working with the autonomous government of the Canary Islands, and they were looking at ways to increase tourism and increase and improve their, you know, the outreach to all sectors of society. And they created something which was fascinating, and it was like an incubator. And what it was is they created space where startups and small companies could gather together and thrive off one another. And they were provided, you know, with accommodation, they were provided with internet access, the likes of that, so that they had the connectivity that they needed. But one thing that they required of everyone was, every Friday afternoon, there was a forum where everyone in this incubator had to get together and talk about what they had done that week and share ideas with all the other startups that were in this incubator. And in that way, they created a innovative situation where great ideas were shared, great thoughts were done, and which was really important, link-ups were made, because people realized, gosh, that person's really got a good idea. You know, this is worth it for me to link up with them and connect with them. So, you know, these type of things that need to happen. I think it's also important that bureaucracy looks at red tape. You know, how long does it take to start up a business? You know, in the Netherlands, you can start up a business within 24 hours by going to a website and registering. In some countries, it can take months, if not years. And if that's the situation, you're never going to allow people to start these startups, start these private sector driven ideas and activities that are going to stimulate activity in the tourism sector. It is too large for the government to be the brain trust, the know-all, the guider of anything that happens. It has to take place in partnerships with the private sector, and that will always depend on the enabling environment. What has the government done to attract, enable, permit, allow, you can use all those positive words, for private sectors and innovators who have great ideas to try them out. If they fail, fine. But we're never going to know unless you give them a chance to try it out.
So again, I think that's a fantastic point, looking at your enabling environment. There's already been, up to before the crisis, I'm sure there have been a lot of studies and recommendations. So now is a fantastic time to really revisit really the top priorities of improving the enabling environment. And this will sort of give the impetus for the government to sort of take action from the recommendations of the private sector. So fantastic point. A follow-up to that is you're looking at incubator, David. What about the role of universities and what can they play in this part as sort of being that intermediary between government and the private sector and using the academic expertise and manpower of the students?
That's another good question. You're involved in a program like that. My sister, who I put that little slide of what she did at the Boschendal farm, got a degree in tourism, and she worked, with the university, which had a very active outreach program in the Stellenbosch area. And if you've been to Stellenbosch, it's a tourism paradise, where they trained businesses, small startups, on how to run a business, the effective things that you needed to do. One of the things that they did, which was critically important, is marketing. You've got to create, websites, social media activities, etc. But you also need to create links to government institutions that are supportive of tourism so that people can understand what the rules, the regulations, the operations they are in. So this is important where universities collaborate with the private sector, but also the public sector, especially with ministries of tourism, ministries of the environment, even ministries of infrastructure, so that they can come up with coalesced, harmonized activities. And I think universities as thought leaders can play an integral role in providing the guidance and the guidelines and the thought leadership and books of knowledge or practice and share those with government institutions and the private sector so that they don't have to waste their time thinking about those, but they're given tools to be able to do what they want to do.
Fantastic. And again, they're a wonderful intermediary, particularly bringing people together in a neutral area for sort of roundtable type of discussions as well, allowing their expertise and with their student manpower. So again, with all of your destinations there, make sure that you're engaging with the universities as well. I think that's a fantastic recommendation. From my very good friend Pankaj Ji in Kathmandu has a question. Let's see, the sunny Salon travel example of Sri Lanka was an apt after, it was a good example after the Easter attack, how it bounced forward in a series of disasters. But now the challenge is unprecedented because the problem is the source of the market globally. How can Nepal learn from your experience in this type of situation for a quick turnaround post-COVID?
I think the most important thing is, you have two types of business people, those who just throw up their hands and walk away and those who are committed and determined. And I think what is important for countries like Nepal is to support businesses and to tell the tourism industry when they are open. There needs to be a big announcement. We are open and we are safe. It's going to be really important for people to understand that measures are put in place for human safety. And so, I think it's going to be a phased thing that, hotels might say that, we are only going to take up half of the capacity in our hotel because we want to maintain safe places. And if I saw that and I heard I was going to go for a hotel that was packed with people, I would choose that other hotel. So I think that, they need to think on messaging that is going to be critically important and tell the truth. Don't tell stories that aren't there, because if you mess up, the social media will wreck you. It's a reality that what happens spreads very, very quickly. And you can just think of all those apps out there, where people write their messages, and you don't want people writing messages that the hygiene of the place was terrible. There was no social distancing. We were crammed into places. We feared for our lives and we checked out of the hotel and went home, or we checked out of the country and went home. It's going to be really important. And I think, screening of tourists, for example, when they arrive, and I mean by that effective screening, not just taking a temperature reading. I think the biggest challenge is going to be when you say to people that they've got to be in 14 days in quarantine before they can actually do any activity. That's going to kill it. So, they have to be patient. But the tourism industry can prepare new activities, as I said, regenerate the hotels, use this as an opportunity to improve things. And that, I think, will give them a wonderful start. That happened in Sri Lanka after the terrorism attacks. Within 3 months, it rebounded, and they were doing all sorts of wonderful things to attract tourists and say that the country was safe again. Unfortunately, they got a double whammy in less than a year.
Here's another question, and this led me to, you brought up, I mean, health and safety are the very prerequisites before any travel. So that should be kind of a fantastic opening point for the government and the tourism industry to be working together right now to focus on certain health and safety standards. So you've just sort of touched upon it, but is there anything else that the private sector needs to be doing to be working with the government to set some sort of foundational safety standards for the return of tourism?
So I think it's really important that hotels and restaurants, for example, once tests become available, can sort of be certified as being safe destinations, because all their health, what would you call it? All their healthcare, I mean, all their workers are certified, however you do that, as healthy. It might also be a prerequisite that when people start applying for visas, that they have to give a certificate of health. I think the people who are going to be the best off, ironically, are going to be the people who have been experienced, who have been exposed to it, and they are, they now resistant to it. Maybe that's where it starts, that those people can submit a certificate proving that they had it and survived it and have, they are recovered. And maybe you start tourism with those people. But I think we just have to think of the multitude of opportunities. But it's absolutely important that points of entry or ports of entry to countries have screening pretty much along the lines like if you go to Korea, even in a normal year, after the SARS and MERS events, they had very strict regulations when you came into the country. And this was even before COVID-19 was on the horizon.
One of the keys, again, for international tourism is airline seats, airline capacity, and really kind of regenerating those source markets. What kind of PPP ideas do you have focused on the airline industry in sort of rebuilding the accessibility from source markets?
Interesting enough, the airline bailouts, many countries are saying, we'll bail out the airlines, but we are going to take a partnership share in the airlines, so that we can ensure that the money is well used and we get our investment back. To me, that sounds like it's inevitably going to be a new form of PPP that may exist. And, so if, any institution that gets bailed out is going to draw the public and private sectors even closer to one another. I think, there's proposals that have been made about airlines also, if you're an economy, instead of sitting 3 across, it's 1 person gap, 1 person, that sort of spacing. But I don't know if that would work effectively. But again, the situation ensuring that aircraft are extremely well sanitized after each flight, that air stewards and crew are, certified and tested, and might be necessary to test them daily. We're hearing about tests that are coming out where people can get their fingers pricked and 15 minutes later, if you're clear or not. That might have to become broad-based, and that could even happen in hotels, so that you can have a situation where people enter these facilities that we know that they are safe.
Well, that's fantastic, David. We're coming up to 11:15, our 1 hour limit here. I want to thank you for the fantastic insight. And again, just sort of recapping, as we look at, public-private partnerships are the foundation for tourism, and it will not work without that close association with the government. Great point too that David brought up is that governments can't do everything. Okay, you shouldn't rely on the government to do everything. That's where, I call it the 125% rule of tourism. You need to put 100% into your business, and then you need to put 25% into your destination. And I think that David has brought up some really good ideas on how to sort of help focus the government on the sort of priority type of projects that you need to focus on. Also, the governments, you need to work on how do we get through this initial stretch of financial of strain on the companies. Interesting PPP about the airlines, governments actually taking a share of the business and being part of it as an operating type of partner there. David, do you want to have any final words before we close out here at the close of the hour?
Tourism is the future of many countries, even the industrialized or the highly advanced countries, you know, which are going into the service industry. I just think you ignore your tourism market at your peril. If you ignore future forward thinking ways to introduce sustainability and resilience, you're going to be susceptible to failures again. But if you do the right things and you build these factors and considerations into PPPs and you have a people focus, you will be much more resilient the next time round.
Fantastic. I want to thank IDI for their sponsorship of this great webinar. I want to thank you, David, for that great insight, good presentation, and really some great, incredible focal points there. Again, the importance of continuing to work together, focus on the top priorities. And of course, I want to thank everybody for attending and taking time out of their day, submitting fantastic questions. IDI, we will be posting the presentation and the recording here on the website. So that will be coming up soon, later on today. Suman, do you have any final questions that you'd like to, or final thoughts to wrap up?
Suman, I don't know if you can just show this quickly as a light-hearted thing.
Yeah, let me do that, David.
Practice social distancing and think about what your countries can do to improve the situation.
Thank you, David. No, thank you. Wonderful moderation, John, and beautiful presentation, David. Hope it was very useful for our participants. You know, we had participants from 14 countries that logged in. It's a very wide range of audience we have reached out today. And if you have any questions, send us an email. And as John said, we will post this video as well as David's presentation, unless David wants to make some more further modifications. So we will make it available for the participants. And if there's any questions, send us an email. And looking forward to your future participation in our upcoming webinars. Just in tourism, we're going to have a webinar very soon on accessible tourism. Look out for the dates. We'll be announcing by Friday. And thank you once again. Have a wonderful day and stay safe wherever you are. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Suman. Thank you, David. Thank you, everybody attending.